voting to start. I'll just wait for OC to give the good go, the green light, the green flag. All right, grand finals. The motion for the House is this House believes that the project of liberal democracy has failed, calling upon the Prime Minister to open up the debate in their name. Hear, hear.
I'm audible and visible.
You are verbal.
Thank you. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Failure is something that is subjective, and it usually depends on the creator of the project. So the limit test is this. If George Washington saw America today, would he feel like it succeeded or it failed? On opening government, we believe that liberal democracy is a promise. It is a promise to people that they can get fair representation, that there's a separation of government. We believe that the project has failed and it will continue to fail. What we have to defend is that it's failed, but in comparison, we don't have to defend other systems, for example, like dictatorship. So I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, is on representation. Second is on separation of power. Quickly then, on representation. Firstly, we think that representation is about equal representation, where everyone, regardless of your race, your socioeconomic status, everyone deserves one vote, right? One person, one vote. But the problem in the status quo oftentimes don't have equal power in voting. I think that oftentimes in a liberal democracy, they prioritize swing voter and marginal seat, which means that oftentimes if you're in a large population, your vote is like significantly diminished in value, right? But two, people oftentimes do not vote because they feel like they're being disenfranchised, or oftentimes they believe that the laws are far too distant from them. Therefore, they don't believe when they vote for something, any change is going to happen. Therefore, they don't vote. There are a couple of structural reasons why this is true. Firstly, I believe that the independent body are actually done like in a biased way, right? So in election committee usually needs to be done by someone, and usually this someone cannot be done in a completely apolitical manner. This is why a lot of times in a particular district, these like election committee tends to be filled in by the political elite. These people are more partisan. They have a leaning towards a particular political body, which means things like you have gerrymandering law, voter ID, like lack of national holidays in order for people to vote. This is why structurally people don't vote enough, right? You also have prisoner dilemma. The reason why you cannot really reform this is because once you try to make it bipartisan, other political parties might not necessarily make this change. And this is particularly harmful. I think secondly, there's also lobbying power, right? If you're a wealthy individual or corporations, it's very easy for you to simply donate to the campaigns of a particular politician in order for you to get policies that you want. This oftentimes means that you have policies that are structurally advantageous to the wealthy individuals. For example, like lower tax. If you're like big corporations, let's say that I'm an oil company, I can continue to fund these like individuals in order for them to support these goals. For example, like oil drills, right? Notice that the amount of power that they have is so deep. Like literally, they're able to fund like opposition challenge, right? If in a Republican during the early 20s, there are actually Republicans that support climate policies. But because within the Republican Party by ExxonMobil, they're actually funding like the opposition candidates to threaten to challenge them. Therefore, a lot of times these like candidates which support science, for example, oftentimes structurally gets replaced. So therefore, it's bad. Thirdly, also, democracy relies on accurate information and properly applying it, right? But the problem is a lot of time media is captured by elite actors and, for example, the state. If you look at major newspaper like Washington Post, it's owned by Jeff Bezos, a billionaire. If you look at Fox News, it's owned by Robert Murdoch, for example. This is when the impact is particularly harmful. For example, things like misinformation, where politicians can outright lie on these television shows, or sometimes spinning an event to something that it's completely unrecognizable for an average readable person, right? This oftentimes means people don't vote along their interests. People don't vote for things that decreases wealth inequality, that increases tax, but they oftentimes vote for more like populist representatives. If you look at cases like in Hungary and America, for example, or there's a trend of like shifting of polarization. Therefore, at the end of this argument, the idea of people being represented is not actually true. The idea that one person, one vote has not been penned out. Before I move on to the second argument, I'll take a POI in closing.
So I'm slightly confused of this motion itself. So is this debate about domestic politics or rather about exporting democracy globally?
It's not about either. It is talking about the idea about liberal democracy at its best case has already failed to function because it is not able to represent people. It is not able to have separation of power, which I'm going to get into. Firstly, on the idea about separation of power, oftentimes the idea about separation of power is that one government who represents the people through signing things like social contract, give up their individual rights in order for the government to execute things, in order to protect things, to pass law enforcement of contract. It's so powerful that we need to break up into branch like judicial, legislative, executive. But the problem is oftentimes it's impossible for them to be able to completely separate it out. Firstly, I think the reason why is because you need to have a final decision power. But the problem is a lot of the time, the way that you fill this in is like structurally problematic. For example, in the court, right? Then the judicial court is supposed to hold the government in balance, but oftentimes because it's nominated by the government or the legislature, these are actually like being like caught up by the party, for example. So you have problems like Republican Party stacking the courts, the Supreme Court. This is why you have overturning of things like Roe v. Wade. You also have stacking of judges in the federal court, which oftentimes means you have a lot of like systemic bias towards a political party, right? Secondly, I also think that we are unable to hold this government accountable. For example, you are unable to hold the government accountable through things like war, for example. The legislature is supposed to have the exclusive rights to declare war, but oftentimes if there's an emergency, people oftentimes fall towards a particular political leader, which means that this gives a president a lot of power. For example, George W. Bush, after the invasion of Iraq, is able to retain, to give the president continuous power to wage war, even though the Constitution is supposed to be a legislature. But secondly, you also have a loss of privacy and civil liberties, right? For example, because of the war on terror, people lost a lot of their privacy, people lost a lot of their ability to decide for themselves. I think this is particularly harmful because if you look at things like war on drugs, for example, this disproportionately hurts like an ethnic minority. If you look at like war on terror, people lost a lot of sense of like privacy on the internet. Notice that the government fundamentally has to defend things like a privacy that is so fundamental. It has to defend things like free speech, but oftentimes this is something that cannot be ensured because the legislature is not able to completely hold the executive in power because the way they envision it oftentimes fails, right? So at the end of the day, what are the impact on the outside of the house? Because of the fact that the government are not representative, one, you continuously have increased wealth inequality. But two, because the government is held hostage, you're not able to do the right thing. For example, you're not able to force these big companies to act about climate change, and then instead you allow them to continue like spin misinformation and to continue to increase the amount of profitization that they have. But thirdly, people do not have the individual right to actually vote in a way that is fair. They don't feel represented. Therefore, oftentimes in democracy, you have like low participation rate, which is why, in conclusion, liberal democracy has failed.
Thank Prime Minister for that fine speech. To introduce the case for the opposition bench, Leader of Opposition. Hear, hear.
Hi, POIs in chat. OG's case is simply to say that the world isn't a utopia, therefore liberal democracy has failed. We think this is a crucial misunderstanding of the way liberal democracy works. Liberal democracy does not operate in a vacuum. This debate demands an assessment of the world, despite humanity's worst tendencies to commit to war, to commit to things like selfishness and stepping on the rights of others, why liberal democracy has still stood strong and allowed for people to fight for things like rights and democracies in places where they otherwise would have been oppressed, would have been persecuted for being who they are. We think that everything OG has talked about, which are the flaws of liberal democracy in ways that I have failed in status quo, are actually reasons to support that the project of liberal democracy has succeeded. Because now we live in societies where people are expected to vote and people recognize the system's flaws, which means that the democratic checks and balances are alive and kicking. The fact that we acknowledge the social contract and the state power to the point where private entities actively attempt to undermine the state supports the fact that liberal democracy has succeeded. Because in a world where liberal democracy has failed, people cannot vote at all. Leaders would declare themselves powerful based on things like them being appointed by God or some arbitrary factor, as opposed to places where people can represent themselves in a world where people can hold hands and sing kumbaya. We think that is something aspirational and is a good thing in the world we live in today. What are the arguments in my speech? First, I want to talk about what the project of liberal democracy looks like. Then I will talk about the government comparative and illustrate what a world where liberal democracy has failed looks like and why that's not the world we live in today. And lastly, I will talk about why the liberal democracy has been great for the global south. Let's first talk about what the project of liberal democracy looks like. We think that liberal democracy, or the project of it, is not about whether liberal democracy in abstract is good or bad in practice. I will outline, as mentioned in the motion clarification, how the project is a social and political and historical ongoing project of liberal democracy. To understand this conception, I will argue why the project has succeeded and from a historical lens and link it back to status quo. So I want to be clear first. Liberal democracy stands for things that are built on democratic mechanisms such as free and fair elections and representation. But what makes it a liberal democracy is that it does so without compromising on values like human rights, freedom of speech, the right to self-determination, etc., which what separates a functional democracy from a liberal democracy. The fact that in a cold and cruel world, most people are unwilling to give in to minorities and vulnerable people in society means that the idea of liberal democracy is aspirational. Yes, people are evil and cruel and bad to other people, but the fact that we have these aspirational values that we still strive for is a notion that we have succeeded in the liberal democracy project. This is how you have things like the development of the United Nations. You have charters protecting minorities, the Western powers recognizing the ability for new democracies to self-determine what they want for their own countries. We think that is a recognition of the liberal democracy project succeeding. Let's start with my arguments now. My first argument will talk about what the government comparative look like where liberal democracy has failed and why that project has not failed because we don't live in that world right now. We think that the project of liberal democracy has its roots after the Cold War, which is the crucial period in history when the West started spreading liberal democracy to counter the communism of the Soviet Union at the time. So the frame here is that the values of liberal democracy back then weren't accepted yet, and it is through the project, crucially, that we were able to spread it to the rest of the world. So this was like World War II and the time before it, where a world where it has failed is a place where it's okay to commit genocide on a specific race, i.e. World War II and the murder of 6 million Jews by Hitler. It is a fractured government where systems of countries can wage war whenever they felt like it because they have a monopoly over violence. Why is this true? We think that this is true because countries and leaders by default revert to things like fascism and totalitarianism for two reasons. The first reason is that leaders have an incentive to do things like fearmonger, to engage in things like populism. You think that populism is bad now? Imagine in a world where liberal democracy is not even a value anybody strive for. These are leaders who want to take advantage of entrenched systems that is self-perpetuating, such as things like monarchies, where you're continuously given power without representing your people just because you were born a specific way. But the second reason to prove why this is true is that people are irrational. They revert to things like religion for an unexplainable thing they don't know how to explain in their lives. People are tribalistic. They revert to people who look like them, who talk like them, and when they see someone who does not look like them, they become angry and irrational and hurt other people for irrational bases. What does this look like? It looks like North Korea, and the fact that the world doesn't look like North Korea is already proof that the liberal democracy project has not failed. And we think it's a sad reality that yes, the West is also vulnerable to these harms. They're vulnerable to doing bad things like waging wars. But the fact that this took the form of liberal values that counter the worst harms of human nature is already a good check and balance mechanism. The fact that when the West wages war, we call them out and we tell the UN that that's not a good thing. The fact that we have this discourse, this democratization of information is proof that the project has succeeded. What happens then on government? Yes, OG doesn't have to defend other forms of governance, but I just proved to you what a world where liberal democracy has failed looks like. We have significantly countered this. The fact that we can recognize that the world we live in right now has democracy and is not a complete failure is a good thing. What do we defend then? Second argument, on our side of the house. We think on our side of the house, you have prompted pushback and discourse on governing system that is most inclusive, which I think is a great thing. So on our side, you have things like people inspired to rise against their colonizers during the decolonial process. Like demanding for representation as minority groups and unity between between ethnic and religious groups, where people are willing to band together and agree on a governing structure across ethno-religious lines. So OG says that the centralization of power and the stepping on rights is inevitable. Stepping on of rights is bad. We think that's inevitable because again, humans tend to look for leaders because they live in a society where there's a hierarchy to who demands certain things. And the fact that people live in societies means that we always trade off rights. Like you do this specific role in society, I do this specific thing. We are constantly trading off power. We are constantly doing these types of things. We think that idea of centralization of power and stepping on rights is inevitable. They can't just say like leaders get to centralize power and that's a bad thing. We think it's inevitable in society. Why is this then good for the global south? Before I move on, I'll take a point from closing.
Is your claim that So is
Sorry,
your claim
go.
is your claim that the government team can't win this debate unless every single country is North Korea, or is the existence of genocide in many countries in the status quo enough to prove that it has failed?
No, you're misunderstanding my argument. I'm explaining that the fact that we have these processes and that we have these checks and balance mechanisms mean that the liberal democracy project has succeeded. So I'm not saying the world has to be North Korea on government, but the fact that we have these mechanisms in place in these countries mean that it has succeeded already. Back to the argument, why has this led to a better world for the global south? 2 points under this. The first is that you have created the platform for countries to push against the decolonial process. The problem is that in a lot of these states, things are drawn across ethno-religious lines. People are constantly at war with each other and refuse to engage with each other on things like racism and xenophobia. And we think the fact that most of the world are functioning democracies is proof that it has not failed, because this means that people have a common ideology to strive for, that they all universally agree is good and are therefore willing to make compromises to give rights to all kinds of individuals. But the second reason why this has been good for the global south, specifically in this historical context, is that it provided recognition for minorities. The fact that you aspire to have values such as your individual right to self-determination, even if the rest of society might not see you for your value because you are of a specific race or a specific minority, the fact that these are universal values people are willing to compromise for when they pay taxes and you get welfare regardless of your background, when people are willing to give you your rights and not subject you to the worst forms of harm, I think that is a good thing that you don't get on their side of the house, because on our side we believe that this has been a success, and the fact that these mechanisms are in place mean that they are self-perpetuating with the checks and balance mechanisms we have mentioned. For these reasons, we're proud to oppose.
I thank LO for that fine speech. To conclude the case for opening government, Deputy Prime Minister. You're here.
Hey, can I be heard?
Yep.
All right. The first thing I want to do in this debate is be very clear about the metric on which you should judge this debate, because the determinant of whether a project is a success or a failure isn't based on what we generally think or in comparison to other contexts. It is merely based on the creator's vision, right? Like, when you created this project, did you think this project would fail or succeed? I'll take a very simple analogy. If, for example, as a country, you had a goal to get a rocket or a spaceship to Mars, right? If your rocket didn't go to Mars, spluttered, and then fell onto the moon, you can't be like, well, actually that project was a success because other countries can't even build a rocket or get a rocket out to space. That project absolutely was a failure. And therefore the flaws within that liberal democracy that perpetuate it, that mean that structurally it cannot achieve the kinds of vision that its proponents and its creators wanted to get to, are the reasons why it fundamentally has failed. Firstly, let's clarify the context of this debate, because I think OO misunderstands and misconstrues liberal democracy with capitalism, right? Like, the thing that was going on during the Cold War was trying to garner for capitalism, not necessarily trying to garner for democracy, which is why, for example, the US was happy to ally with a lot of countries that weren't actually democracies, but were quite capitalist in its making. I think that the place where liberal democracy evolved and was created was far earlier, envisioned far earlier. It looks like the constitutional construction of the American Constitution between the founding fathers. It looks like the writing of the Federalist Papers when they first imagined what it was like to have a Western liberal democracy, one where you had people represented, one where you had civil liberties. And I think that's where the kind of goals we're looking at. The goals isn't like, how well did we manage to fight communism during the Cold War or fight totalitarian authoritarianism? Last clarification is, they say it's an ongoing project in the motion clarification. I think this doesn't really matter. It's probably a benefit for us because we just have to prove the structural reasons why democracy will continue to fail into the future. So the fact that it's ongoing isn't a harm to us, but it's actually a harm to opposition side, because what you have seen in democracy is that you've seen a lot of backslides where a lot of problems that didn't used to exist have now existed. Like, for example, during George Washington's time, gerrymandering didn't exist. Corporate lobbying didn't exist. Things like misinformation really didn't exist. And those things have become far worse and far more entrenched through populist governments, which means that the project, if anything, has backslided and become worse since the first point of envisionment and construction. Now let's move on to the first issue about representation. I would say this is probably the key tenet of liberal democracy, the idea that every person gets one vote and they want to be represented in government. What we explain simply is that elections need to be made fair and accountable. And in order to make sure elections are fair, to make sure people aren't like double voting, people are legitimate, people are citizens and all that kind of stuff, you need independent curators who can make sure that that election runs smoothly. The structural problem as to why you can never truly have an effective liberal democracy is because that curator cannot be truly independent, right? Like no one is truly independent because every single agent within a country has incentives. That is why independent processes such as the judiciary are captured by the Republicans. It's why election committees are captured by Republicans who try to use gerrymandering to get what they want in drawing the lines and boundaries between electors. What do they say to this? They say, well, the proof that our democracy works is that when things go bad, people are expected to vote, and that's a check and balance. People see that there's bad things with the government, people dissatisfied, and they vote in ways that fix that. The weird thing about democracies is that it's actually totally the opposite, because we explain in our mechanization that if anything, when governments fail, people feel disengaged and disaffected with that democracy, which either means one, they don't turn out, which means they actively fail to work as a check and balance, because like, for example, minorities within a government, like African Americans in America or indigenous people in Australia, don't go up and show up to the polls because they feel like that government has failed them and will continue to fail them. So that check and balance lever is actively faulty. Or they vote with really poor information because they buy into populist narratives about how those things are fixed, which means that for a liberal democracy project to work, you can't just have people to have like good intentions and work as a check and balance. That check and balance needs to work with good information. And that good information is very, very easily manipulated because of the way society is set up, in ways that the media is controlled, the way that information can be spread and can be lied upon, which means that that check and balance is fundamentally faulty and cannot be fixed into the future. And they have not provided a mechanism to do so. If they could provide a mechanism to do so, then America would be a great country and those things would have been solved. But I don't think that they can. But secondly, we explained that the power to control that information is obviously controlled. Yeah, I already covered that. Oh, well, Cavan, I'll take your POI.
Yeah, we all aspire for a perfect world, but in the real world, we operate on comparisons and likelihoods and mechanisms. You cannot make a utopia your alternative.
No, I agree with that, but a lot of people have high expectations for projects that they make. Like there are some people that just have very high expectations for their career and see it totally as a failure each and every time. Like you can't just be like, oh, this topic is unfair for us because you set the metric that way. The creators of democracy had envisioned a way that democracy would look. They saw it as true representation, and that true representation hasn't been accomplished. Now let's talk about accountability and civil liberties. The thing that I'll keep saying is the word check and balances. I already explained why one lever of check and balance of people enfranchisement does not work. But let's talk about the other forms of checks and balances. The problem with checks and balances is that they run into a flux between either too easily being able to be influenced or too unaccountable. Let's take an example of the judiciary, for example. Yeah, the courts are supposed to keep the government in check. The problem, though, is that it's hard to keep the courts truly independent because, you know, Republicans can just stack the court with like Republican judges, which means that you don't have that separation of powers, which fails a tenet of liberal democracy, of accountability. The problem then is there are some countries that give courts a lot of overwhelming power, which means that they're free from repercussion from government. So, for example, there are very extensive term limits set on Australian or Canadian judges, for example. But then the problem then is that those judges are then totally unaccountable to the people because the executive or the legislature cannot get rid of them for this very reason that you wanted to keep them independent. You now can't get rid of them, which means judges don't have to retire until they're like 75. And during their 40 years of reign, they can literally do whatever they want. They can have a legal fiction. That's why in those countries you have things called living constitutions, where even though the constitution is only a few pages, the judges often interpret those few pages to books worth of policy implications in ways that are totally unaccountable to people. That's why you have things like Roe v. Wade happening. But also notice how fragile democracies are. The fact that within one term, America can literally backslide from a good functioning democracy to one that is seriously under question during the Trump government. The fact that Turkey during COVID could activate a set of emergency powers without sunset periods that just annihilated democratic freedoms. The fact that you have a number of governments in the world like the PAP, the ANC, or the Liberal Democrats in Japan that are just run by one dynasty who are able to manipulate misinformation and loyalties of the population in a way to keep grips on people forever. Democracy had a set of contradictions in the ways that it's of mechanisms and checks and balances that is supposed to keep itself to account. You can never solve those checks and balances and those mechanisms. For these reasons, very, very proud to propose.
Thank Deputy Prime Minister for that speech. To conclude, top half, Deputy Leader of Opposition to end off their case. Hear, hear.
Hello, everyone. Just give me a moment. I need to organize my notes and also drink water. Yes, yes. Okay. Okay, so I'm done organizing my notes. I'll now drink the water. Okay.
Chat POS.
Oh, yes, POIs in chat, please. My question to opening government is, who is the creator of democracy and how do they know his vision or her vision? Because when civilizations first emerged, humans were faced with the question of what is the most optimal and equitable way to organize ourselves. From the ashes of feudalism and fascism rose the concept of liberal democracy, and that's when the project began. The first stage of this project was through the development of ideology. Concepts like freedom and dignity are social constructs and don't come intuitively to us, but these concepts were brought to life and made important because part of the project of liberal democracy was to articulate to people and to convince people that ideas like expression and freedom were something that were important and ought to adhere in the human condition. Before this, Naomi told you that people had harmful beliefs. They believed things like your race or your class determines whether you can access freedom or happiness in life. We believed things like violence and conquest entitled us to subjugate others. Human beings are ultimately primal tribal creatures, and the project of liberal democracies made us see the humanity in others because it told us that abstract ideas like freedom were something that were important and something worth recognizing. It is true that discrimination still exists in the modern world, but the concept of liberal democratic values empowered the oppressed to challenge the status quo, to use these values as a rallying call for their social movements that we currently see today. But these values did not just manifest in an academic or conceptual way. They manifested in tangible ways that are incredibly dismissive of the opening government. It created constitutions, multi-party politics and free elections, separations of powers and political representations. These are intrinsically good things that help people of different ethnic or religious groups coexist and see commonality with one another, where they're all working together to build towards a democracy. It helps people participate in the process of nation building, and it protects us from the tyranny of dictators and autocrats. The litmus test that opening government uses is that, well, this unequal representation now and democracy is flawed now. This is an absurd Asian parent level expectation that the only way for us to measure success is if we have a perfect democracy where there's no flaws in the system and everything is completely perfect. This cannot be the standard you adjudicate success or failure. Here's the engagement. Liberal democracies, as Luigi very eloquently puts it in the motion clarification, is an ongoing project. So current imperfections are not proof that the project is irredeemably failed, but rather it's just proof that the project is ongoing, which I'm allowed to say because Luigi said the project is ongoing. So as long as we can prove that the current fights against the imperfection are present and are strong, then that itself can be one measure of success. And we see this right now when we fight for transparency and accountability. We see this right now when social movements call out things like vote rigging or the controlling of votes, for example, in the Trump administration. Those very active call-outs against the flaws in the system are proof that the liberal democracy project has been successful because it's been able to highlight these problems. And note, the ability to highlight and identify problems allows people to solve the problems. Without the project of liberal democracies, when people are oppressed, they would just think it's the status quo. They would just think that this is the natural way in which humanity has emerged. They wouldn't question that people are deserving of freedom or people are deserving of dignity. So the success here, which is quite unrefutable, is that the project of liberal democracy introduced into the cultural consciousness of humanity that liberal values like respecting other people, like being free, like not letting autocrats control you, were things that were important. Opening government's examples, therefore, are extremely context specific. For many people, the project of liberal democracies empowered them to overthrow their colonial masters or dictators. The period of decolonization in Southeast Asia, the Arab Springs in the Middle East, they were born because those individual leaders and the individual civilians on the ground decided that this project was important. They decided that then and there, they would embark on that project. And if those individuals decided that they wanted to embark on that project to overthrow the autocrats or to overthrow their colonial masters, and they successfully did so and established a national identity, that also is a measure of success and something that is equally valuable and equally validated. These countries are still imperfect today, we agree. But things like elections, constitutions, and having a democratic consciousness are things that also irrefutably still exist. So if you just ignore the incredibly high and insane bar that opening government has set for success, which is that you must have completely transparent democratic institutions that are completely infallible, you will quickly realize that many things were established by the project of liberal democracies. There are elections, there is transparency. Is it perfect? No, but things were established, and establishing things is also a marker of success. So just to use the analogy against David again, maybe you don't go to Mars, but making the rocket is a measure of success, and it's also proof that maybe in the future you could go to Mars. Again, Luigi says this is an ongoing project. But for countries that were previously ethnocentric or under a monarchy, the implementation of minority representation in parliament is a huge evidence of success. The ability for ethnocentric communities to have a parliament that represents other individuals that are not from the ethnicity is a huge marker of success. So I don't want you to mistake my speech to say that we are setting the bar for success is extremely low. That's not my case. Being able to have a constitution when your country was previously under autocracy is a huge marker of success, and it's a huge milestone that ought to be celebrated. They point towards a lot of contemporary observations like, well, misinformation currently exists right now, but it isn't a structural reason why democracy is always doomed to fail. It just shows that there's current flaws in the system, but something flawed can still be successful. I'm an incredibly flawed debater, but you can also say that I am, okay, I won't say that, that's kind of cringe, but how do you weigh this claim in the debate? This debate cannot just be won through example trading, like the US being shit or Southeast Asia being shit. This debate can't be won through an absurd standard of having a perfect democracy. Panel, the question you need to ask yourself is, what did the project of democracy set out to do? It made the ideology valued and important in political discourse. And the project lives in the Black Umbrella protesters in Hong Kong. It lives in the protesters in the Arab Spring. It lives in Black Lives Matter movement. And the success is evident when we gave these groups the vocabulary and imagination to argue that their dignity is important. Before I move on, I'll take a POI from opening government.
So I point out some structural contradictions, such as how it's impossible to design a court that is both independent and accountable. You need to provide a working solution to those problems. Otherwise, saying it's ongoing doesn't matter if these structural problems are entrenched in the system of democracy.
So I'm not a political science student, so I won't answer that question that way. I'll just say the debate response I will give you is that points one aspect that the project of liberal democracy has failed, which is the separation of power. There are many other aspects in which it succeeds as well. The burden on opening government was to explain why that one facet failing mean that the whole project had to fail. Note, the project of liberal democracy is just not it's not just about the implementation of democracy. It was about creating safeguards against dictators. And this analysis cleanly wins us the opening half, because those safeguards are alive and well today. We have parliaments, we have separate courts, we have elections, we have constitutions. The reason why Trump got voted out and is facing criminal charges now is evidence that the project has succeeded. The reason why this standard of success is important is because the future is constantly unpredictable. There will always be a power-hungry leader that can rise to the system and entrench power. There will always be examples of failure or examples of imperfection. The measure of success is whether the safeguards that they set out to put have been alive and whether they are invigorated and whether they're important now. Of course, undeniably, they still are.
I thank DLO for that fine speech, and I thank top half for what has been a wonderful debate so far. Let's introduce closing half to the debate with Member of Gov's extension. Hear, hear.
Am I audible?
You are.
Awesome. Liberal democracy was built on two assumptions that are no longer valid in the modern world. The first is that we have control over our own preferences to the extent that we can then use our preferences to vote to get them amalgamated. But secondly, also that we are able to effectively represent those preferences and amalgamate it to form a level of policy. That may have worked in the past, but no longer. We don't necessarily have the locus of our own preferences centered in us, and it's rather centered on corporations and companies, but also any vested interests that are able to influence us through the means of social media, through the means of behaviorist influence, but also the complex nature of the world actually means that there's a huge information asymmetry in terms of how democracy actually deals with problems in the world, which means that you're actually unable as an individual to have any sort of full information to make those kinds of decisions, and that actually is the mechanization that is required for opening government's elite capture material. I'm going to explain those two things as extensions in my speech. I'm going to briefly describe what the problem with opening half is, weighing our extensions over what we heard from opening half. Opening government says that the problem with democracy is that there are all these things that actually chip away at how representative democracy is. You have things like lobbying and gerrymandering, etc., etc. Opening opposition says, well, it's possible to fix those kinds of things and it can be fixed, and therefore democracy as a project has not failed. The problem with this is though that firstly it's largely dependent on the semantics of success, and I don't think debating about semantics is that fun at all. But the way to kind of get around this problem is to understand that if democracy says they're able to do certain things at the very core of democracy, which is that individuals can vote on their own benefit or on their own preferences, and that somehow that system is able to relatively well incorporate that, and that fails, that means that the entire system is founded on a lie, and that the way the modern world has evolved means that democracy as a project in and of itself has failed. The second problem with the opening half, and I think as kind of realized by DLO, which is that it relies on examples of success and failure, and which is unclear as to which, like whether the US, for example, is the locus of this debate, whether it's failed or whether it's failed in other countries. It's clearly that there are good and bad examples of all these things, good examples of harms to democracy, things can be fixed. We're going to take the higher burden and show that inherently democracy is flawed in the modern world. The first thing I want to deal with before that is some of the insane burden pushes we heard from opening opposition. Obviously, this is not an aspirational thing in setting that ideology. Setting that ideology in, moving towards liberalism doesn't need to include liberal democracy. The second level here, though, is even if you move towards liberalism, if you are unable to actually access that amalgamation of preferences, then it's a meaningless promise that you made to individuals. The project in and of it has failed. But also, we don't need to look at what it would have looked like before democracy to show what the failure afterwards would be, because in the failure in the world that it looks like right now, which is completely unimaginable to the people who started democracy, whoever they may be, it is different. And so therefore the failure will also look different. I will describe what the failure looks like. If you have any questions, I can take a POI now, or I can wait till you get to the extension. I don't see any POI, so I'll keep going. Firstly, as to why our economic and social structure is way too complicated for democracy to adequately react or even amalgamate those preferences. The first is in terms of economically, the global sphere before, in terms of when you were siloized in different towns and communities, and then into relatively large states, think of the Greek states, and then after, after World War, you have the formation of more structured nation states, are now integrated very significantly through supply chains. We rely on each individual product that's made, goes through so many different countries. That also means that the integrated communities that exist between the social and cultural spheres, because the internet means that interaction is increasingly complex. The first problem is that democracy is way too slow to react to those shocks. Firstly, shocks are actually more impactful because you have that interconnectedness, which means a democracy that takes some time to react to that means that if they aren't able to kind of amalgamate your preferences in reaction to the shocks, they also already fail in their promise to deliver those outcomes to you. But also, even though the rate of shocks are the same, because of the interconnectedness, each individual democratic nation has to deal with more shocks because they are affected by more shocks because of the integration. But secondly, democracy is also way too short-termist. That means you're unable to kind of plan for the long term because you're worried about winning the population right now. The flip of this, though, is that if it's not the case and you're able to look at other things like polarization and populism to control your population to vote for the specific party that you want to, or vote for you, that is inherently means that you're not relying on their preferences currently. Thirdly, the complex interactions actually leads to the information asymmetry where elites have way more power. So people rely then on information channels to believe that the world would work the way the politicians say it is. And that unlocks the elite capture mechanism that opening government kind of relies on US examples to get through. That means you don't get the proper accountability or check and balances on their side. And as I'll explain, the siloization of information of different groups means you aren't able to agree on a common truth, which is like the basis of any sort of discussion that results to that preference amalgamation. And without that, you're unable then to ever get any sort of consensus on what to do. And that means democracy inherently has failed in those instances. But democracy is also individualized in terms of game theory, right? So when it doesn't work for all those reasons, people react badly, and that's why you get more populism over and over again, because you see that democracy may have failed you in one instance. And that's why you have this paradoxical situation where you vote against democracy and you vote against future control of your life because you think that it's better than having this failed system try and amalgamate those preferences. I'll take a point very quickly from opening opposition.
Both government teams explain why the theory of democracy is flawed, but this debate is about success. If you succeed at implementing a bad concept, it's still a success at implementing the concept.
Well, I'm talking about how the concept in and of itself can't work in the modern world. And so therefore, it doesn't matter if you can do some amount of it, because moving forward, it's going to get far, far worse, which means you're unlikely. And the promise of democracy right now is a facade. The tail wags the dog, not the other way around. Let's talk aggregation of preferences and why it's failed, right? So firstly, you have just manufactured consent in terms of the ads, the way that people interact with information right now. And it's very prevalent in all the systems we use. So Pandora's box has been opened. The algorithm that individually curates our fields means that the ad-based economy of the is the foundation of how the internet works. So in the world where you have the internet and you're walking back and not having the internet, which would be insane for opposition to support, this has fundamentally changed how our preferences are actually created and are met. So firstly, there's massive access to your data, and the increased interaction with tech in everything like phones, CCTV, smart devices means that you're able to get that data collected by data brokers and then sell it on to third parties. Even though it's anonymized, there are multiple identifiers, means that it's very easy to individually target people or target demographics. That plus the increasing use of behaviorist theory like B.F. Skinner's stuff taught us that our decisions aren't really ours, and that subtle influence and control of our emotional response and the addictive consumption of social media means that you get that harm of not actually being able to choose what you want, but instead the companies and governments and people who have control over that, or even just general systems, are able to convince you as to what you want. So it's not your true preferences that ever get amalgamated in democracy. Opening government says misinformation by media, but it's more than that, right? Because of those algorithms, you have siloization of information streams and algorithmic echo chambers, and the distraction from our own preferences and make us vote against our own interests, that can't be fixed because the technology exists. This meets a higher burden placed by opening opposition. So it's an inbuilt failure of democracy, not just that characterized by, like happens in the US by opening government, but it also affects the very checks and balances that opening opposition requires to show success. Democracy, unfortunately, in the modern world is completely defunct, and whatever system that comes up afterwards better be better.
I thank Member of Gov for that fine speech. To introduce the extension for closing opposition, Member of Opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, great. I'll like to take POIs by chat. I'll try to take from opening if they have one at about 5-minute mark. Hopefully we have time. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Two contributions coming from closing opposition. Firstly, why we empower a grassroots movement, flipping all of the material that government side posits. Second, why we empower people even within like authoritarian states by changing the incentive of authoritarian leaders to be much more benevolent. But before that, 3 pieces of setup because I think the debate was quite messy. First, was that when we talk about what we mean by failure, I think there's 2 things. First, that governments have to prove that there have been substantial harm that actually existed in the status quo. And obviously, in the opening half debate, there have been multiple example clashes, which ultimately means that this is a deadlock. It basically, whether it succeeded or not, depends upon the context to which this depends upon the context. Second is that they also have to prove to us that there is significantly a better alternative compared to liberal democracy, which means that they have to be, in a relative sense, why liberal democracy failed to meet its objectives. What I mean by this is that obviously liberal democracy have metrics to which you can judge things like, for instance, media freedom that you have, or for instance, media scrutiny and whatnot. But even if you have the metric to which you can judge, you never really know if the metric is actually fulfilled or not on either side of the odds. You never really know that simply because there is no objective factor to which you can actually know whether this metric can be fulfilled or not, which ultimately means even if, for instance, you have like 2 or 3 media institutions that are free from government like intervention, how do you know that actually fulfill media scrutiny and whatnot? You never really know that, which means the only way in which you're able to know that this metric is fulfilled is to compare that to the status quo and explain if that actually was better than the status quo. That is the point to which I think that's the point to which democracy didn't really fail. A second piece of setup is that obviously we don't really have a high burden to prove that this is a success, because obviously this is not a zero-sum game in which you can fail and success. There's obviously morally dubious instances in which it's either not a fail or success, which ultimately means that we don't have to prove that this is likely to be successful. We only have to prove that this is dubious at best. With this, I think still does not mean that this is completely failing. I think that still a lot is able to win the debate. Then moving on to my first extension on why we're able to empower grassroots movement. I think opening opposition, what they try to do here is they first say that, people are likely to be inspired to rise against colonizers, but then they never really explain to us why. And the reason that's why this is very important is because you're likely to be only inspired if you know what are the chances that you have to actually fight back. Obviously, if you don't have any kind of chance to actually fight back, you're not likely to be inspired, which means OO's mechanism has to be further mechanized to explain what are the further mechanisms to which you're able to fight back. And that is the point to which people are likely to be inspired, leading to all of the opening opposition benefits that they actually want to proclaim. And more importantly, when the opening opposition just says, well, we have just voters like just voting, or for instance, you have political transparency and whatnot, the point to which they do not have any structural reasons, but they also claim that, well, this is the ongoing process. If they do not have structural mechanisms to back their claim, it is more likely that opening government or closing government is correct in the sense that you're likely to have backsliding democracies existing under their side. I think that is the way we mechanize all those claims, we are able to win the debate. How we are able to do that? 4 reasons why. First, I think people are just much more afraid, or like leaders are much more afraid of revolutions, about the democratic revolutions, whatnot, simply because you have, for instance, seen how uprooting of your power has come, where obviously the leader is ousted and you're oftentimes forced to die a tragic death. And I think, for instance, if your neighborhood or a friendly neighbor that you had, a neighbor leader, obviously was ousted and killed by a coup, or killed by a democratic revolution, you're more likely to be afraid of that, and therefore it's likely to change behavior, because the cost of, for instance, not doing human rights violation obviously is less compared to the cost of getting killed, which is the reason as to why you're likely to be changing behaviors on our side. You're more likely to be listening to people. But second, I think there's also a reparation mechanism existing under our side when the genocide or other types of toxic human rights violation happen. Things like, for instance, international organization or Truth Reconciliation Committee that commits things like investigative journalism that oftentimes, because a lot of countries try to hide this information existing, but it is the point to which TRCs or IOs have with investigative journalism that does not gain consent from the country to whether they want to go to this country or not. Actually, that's the point to which when they release this information, it's the point to which you raise awareness, which further mechanizes all those points, by the way. But second, I think there's also international norms or perceptions existing that force you to redress, or force the leaders who have committed a human rights violation to actively regress, considering that one, if there is international organization that criticizes you, or for instance makes a joint joint legislations, whatnot. Or second, you oftentimes have retaliatory trade tariffs, or oftentimes countries are not able to trade with you. But third, oftentimes simply because West oftentimes pays careful attention to other countries or other countries existing within other areas, that is the point to which you get far more likelihood that you're likely to get redress. But third, even if all leaders do not follow this, there are other mechanisms to resort to, which is my third claim, which is that there is likely to be international human rights court, or for instance, treaties. Oftentimes, human rights is likely to be subjective, which is the reason why, even if there's like cultural norms existing, like for instance, like wearing hijab is like goes something whatnot, is a human rights violation that is not, it's still morally ambiguous. And therefore, you're not able to get public support within, for instance, or within the domestic arena. You're not likely to get, for instance, legal help or whatnot. But it is with the international human court, with the international norm that is set, that you're more likely to be getting help under our side of the house. But lastly, I think you also have significant amount of developmental aid that is conditioned to, for instance, things like political transparency, or for instance, conditioned to things like women's participation, whatnot. I think the reason as to why you do this is simply because there's a perception when it comes to liberalism that everyone needs to live a dignified life. That is the reason why a lot of the people in the West, even if they're think that they're like giving money within the fixed budget that the country has to another person with different ethnicity who have never even met you. But exactly because of that idea, people are more likely to be giving money away to these people so that you're able to increase political participation in countries that you have never really seen. But lastly, I think secondly, I think countries also have I think countries also have self-interest as well. Simply because if you're, for instance, giving money to IMF, you obviously want that money to be turned back. And the point to which you want to increase political, and therefore, I think it is much better that you increase political transparency within that country, so the country has more of a capacity to pay back to you after they have lent you the money. So I think what all of this implies is that we have further mechanized Owo's case in a sense that that allows people to actually be inspired and fight back. The impact of this is then, one, people are more likely to be politically represented, which is what opening government and closing government wants. Second, you just have more chance to fight back and give people proper redress as well. Second, I want to talk about why we are able to change the incentive of authoritarian leaders. Other than the fact that people's incentive change as a public, I think one important mechanism that I want to point out is that if people really believe in the fact that if people in China want to believe that in fact human agency is really, really important, the leader has to justify in other way why you're currently repressing human rights to begin with. Which means either you want to, one, justify that with a significant amount of economic growth, which is obviously something that is good. But second, you also have to do things like wealth redistributions or other mechanisms to which you allow people to be happy, allowing, for instance, things like media scrutiny and whatnot in some instances. So what this ultimately provides to you is that we have other mechanisms to which you're able to help people out and, I guess, increase people's agency. And I think that's the way in which we win. Very proud to.
I thank member of OP for that fine speech. To conclude the Gov bench as a whole, Gov Whip, you're here.
Oh, just checking I'm audible.
You are.
Lovely. Three things in the speech. Firstly, on CO. Secondly, going over our extension and why it outweighs all the other teams. And then specifically on OO. In terms of CO, what do they tell us? Couple of things. Firstly, that they're able to protect human rights, including in other countries like authoritarian regimes. Three things to note. Firstly, this is just obviously empirically not true. Look at democracies like Turkey and the fact that there are literal genocides occurring against the Kurds. Secondly, the material on like revolutions and how the threat of democracy coming means that authoritarian states are unlikely to do bad things is entirely symmetric, because obviously a non-democratic revolution or a non-democratic coup is also a deterrent to doing really, really bad things to your citizens. Your citizens would probably support a military coup if you're doing really bad things to them. So there's other mechanisms not unique to democracies. But thirdly, democracy doesn't equal human rights. So there are still ways that so even in a world with failed democracies, there are still like international orders in terms of sanctioning countries that are doing other bad things. But note that the way that we uniquely flip this is to say that obviously democracies become more isolationist into the future when they see that you are having to spend a lot of your own resources dealing with things that are happening in other countries, which means that you end up isolationist and you end up being less likely to intervene in authoritarian states where the worst abuses are happening. Clearly, then. Clearly then it's far better on our side. The broad material that CO brings you is to say that like a liberal democracy hasn't failed if the alternative is worse. But two things to note here, or like based on practical outcomes. I think very clearly the mechanisms that Shah gives you about how you're not even voting in your own interest means that you are getting actively harmful outcomes. Because if you are voting against things that are good, then you get a bad practical outcome. So even if you believe that this debate is only about practical outcomes, then clearly we win. But secondly, we tell you that this debate should be more abstract and about going back to the fundamental purpose of democracy, like right from ancient Greece, which is two things. Firstly, that you're able to pick your own preference, and secondly, that you effectively aggregate those preferences. And note there was no engagement with all of the dense material that Shah gives you about how that fundamentally doesn't happen, but also that it gets worse into the future as you get more things like big data. That means that fundamentally you can never meet the most basic, the most principled point of a democracy. Clearly then democracy is failing. Let's now talk about why our extension is incredibly important and specifically why that outweighs OG. Obviously, our case explains at the most primal level that there are not just flaws and like checks and balances aren't being met, but that the key idea of a democracy, which is that you can be able to vote in your interest and that those interests get aggregated into the way that is doing the best thing for the most interests, are not happening. And that's the upstream reason that OG missed about that results in a lot of the examples that they use where the team that actually told you why that's true. So all of their material about like how wealthy people have more power, I don't think that that's something that an average reasonable voter would just randomly believe. But we tell you the reason why that happens is because people are aggregating their preferences in a wrong way that is able to give power to a few people who are then able to use that in the ways that opening government talks about. So we're the team that unlocks those benefits. But the other reasons why our material was more important than what opening government gives you is a couple. Firstly, we tell you that even in the best democracies, so not just the US, which has other flaws in terms of things like hyperpolarization, that there are still problems in the best democracies like the EU and like New Zealand, because we're not able to appropriately aggregate those preferences for all the reasons that Shah gives you, in terms of there being far too much information, in terms of not being able to meet that. And secondly, and most importantly, we've shown that this trend is going to get worse as things like an increased amount of information and an increased amount of misinformation from data and things like that get worse. That means that not only is democracy failing, but that there is no potential for it to get better into the future. Before I move on to opening, I'll take them.
if the project is ongoing, we cannot judge it as a final product. Instead, we need to see whether there's been milestones that have been achieved. Why has been the establishment of democratic norms and those norms considered important and valid, not milestones we can consider as versions of success?
Yeah, well, obviously, as I literally just mentioned, we're the only team that explained why democracy gets worse into the future, which is to say we brought you the really important material, which is that as there is more data in society and as there is more control being put into the hands of the few who have access to that data, who are able to use it in ways that manipulate you as a individual for parties to be able to claim that voting for this party is going to be in your interest, even if that is literally a false policy. Look at things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal. All of those things get worse. So when opening opposition tells you that, oh, it's currently imperfect, but it gets better, no, we've explained why it gets worse. So clearly they're unable to win on that. What were their other weird claims they tried to win on? And they say that liberal, their POI about how liberal democracies have been implemented in countries like the Arab Spring, which has freed people. Well, I think this is a great example of failure of democracies because every single state reverted. Literally right now, there is not one state that is still a democracy. And that's because of all of the problems that are inherent. That's because of the flaws that are inherent that Shah brings you at member, and because of what opening government tells you that is uniquely only unlocked by us giving you the structural reason for why you end up with those flaws and those checks and balances not working. But the last thing to note with opening opposition is they tell you that just because systems exist, it assumes that those systems work and therefore that you're able to call them out. But clearly that is just not true, because in both North Korea and in New Zealand, you can be an oppressed minority who demands for improvements, but in neither side you are going to get them. You still have those same flaws because you have the flaws of this being short-termist and just focusing on the next election and not focusing on what is long-term best for everybody. Therefore, clearly, just because you have a system that might be able to work, it never actually does. And so democracy has failed. It purports to give people those rights, but it never actually does. So proud to stand against democracy.
I thank Gov Whip for that fine speech. To conclude this debate as a whole and the dying breaths to defend democracy, up Whip.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
I'll take POIs in the chat. Just, put them in the chat. Don't unmute yourself. Just give me 1 sec. All right. I'm going to begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. I first want to make a correction of what the metric of this debate is, because what opening government asserts is that the metric should be based on what the initial creator wanted. But firstly, I'd suggest that many people embarked the democracy project to the point where I do not think that one individual who came up initially with this project, their calculation should be the one that trumps over other individuals' intention when they opt in or embark in this project. But secondly, I'd suggest that they do not even explain what this initial creator's intention really is. And I suggest that initial creator wanted to increase the political participation and actually protect human rights and stuff like this. Closing government's assertion, which I think is ridiculous, is to suggest that the democracy it does not equate to human rights. But this is literally an assertion. I'd suggest that things like freedom of speech, things like freedom of religion, things like the ability for you to opt into things like assembly and have political participation are all part and parcels of liberal democracy. That sure, democracy itself might have been created prior to the conception of human rights, but I suggest that many things overlap to the extent that closing government cannot just dismiss in that way. The last thing I would suggest here is that democracy is something that I think is quite malleable, which is to suggest that when it comes to the Greek democracy, you had like direct democracy, wherein we have things like representative democracy in the status quo. So it is unclear to me as to why whatever the initial creator thought of should be the fixated notion of what this project actually looks like. The second thing that I want to then establish is the metric coming from closing opposition that I do not think that CG was able to sufficiently respond to, which is to suggest that the motion requires government to justify why the democracy project in its totality has failed, not is failing currently, which is to suggest that firstly, that means that for them to meet this threshold, they need to explain not just the idea that democracy has imperfectly been implemented, but it's to suggest that there has been a substantial level of harm that has been done in a retrospect, like from the moment in which we started this project to the current status quo. And I think that that is why Haeseong's explanation on why that is extremely speculative, because while I do agree that in some countries you might have democratic backsliding, as opening opposition quite correctly observed, some countries have increased in the democratization process, also suggests that this entire matter dumping of in some countries there is democratic backsliding because of misinformation is something that is not really important in this debate because it's a deadlock, and it's speculative as to whether or not that actually means that, like, democracy has failed in its entirety. But secondly, and this is the most important contribution coming from closing opposition, which is to suggest that for you to say that this has failed, they need to provide why there's a viable alternative. Other than that, I do not think that they can say that this has failed insofar as this actually increased the political participation and allowed for individuals to live a better life. I want to engage a little bit more closely to closing government, because they say that democracy takes time and there are imperfect information. The first thing I would suggest here is that there is no standard of what constitutes perfect information or what it means to even be perfectly informed. And if that is true, insofar as there is no alternative, and if it is true that closing government says that being perfectly informed is unrealistic, that just means that this is not really part of this debate. The second thing that I will say here is that it is unlikely that the project is unrealistic as both opening government and closing government asserts, because what we explained from Haeseong's speech is that it is not about making people fully aware prior to making voting, but it's also about things like, for instance, giving people the mechanism to insulate themselves at the point in which their rights are curtailed or are deceived by misinformation. But lastly, I would suggest that the provision of information might have become harder due to AI, maybe in countries like New Zealand, but I think that in other parts of the world, the access to information also increased, which is why CG's extension is just an entire deadlock. They do not explain why the context of New Zealand should apply to all instances, and to the extent that you need to evaluate democracy has failed in its totality. The next thing I want to do then is weigh our case over opening opposition. Opening opposition relies on the idea that there could be democratic check and balances. But the first problem with this, or a general problem with this, is that there's a lack of mechanization as to how you get this, because their entire idea is that people demand for change towards colonization because people are inspired. But as what Haeseong already explains, they do not explain why people are going to be inspired, or what exactly do these inspired people do in order to restore democracy. We gave you many reasons coming from closing opposition exclusively. Firstly, things like the concession that all human beings need to deserve dignity, and that is the concession and rationale behind things like giving developmental aid, or things like condition to increase political transparency or women's participation to receive these aids to begin with, or things like ICC and TRC that investigates human injustice and reveals information, things like human rights court that pressure states when they oppress freedom of speech and press, and things like this. Because closing the opposition or government's only response to this is that but there are currently countries that do also curtail freedom of speech. But the point is, at the point in which they do that, the citizens are then able to make things like individual appeal to be able to hold these governments to account. Look at countries like literally Belarus that has like hundreds of individuals doing things like individual appeal to UN Human Rights Court in order to protect their freedom of speech and things like this. All just suggests that this is something that we have we have the mechanism to protect these kind of things under our side of the bench. Firstly, I suggest that this is important because this addresses specifically to countries that did not have democracy in the first place, which is the majority of democracy. Secondly, it suggests that the project is not about whether or not this is perfect, but it's about the proliferating value. We mechanize that from closing opposition. But thirdly, if failure or deficiency happens, there's a correction mechanism uniquely as a result of this project. So I do not care if 14-minute OG case says it's imperfect. We have the solution that does not exist if this project did not happen. I'll take a point from OG.
We explained that if a state is controlled by corporate lobbying and misinformation, it doesn't matter how good that system is, it definitionally has stopped becoming a democracy. It's not a system where governments are represented by the people.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that right now, but I think that the responses that I gave to CG is sufficient to knock that out insofar as maybe some countries have corporate capture, other countries did not. You do not explain why some countries like, I don't know, New Zealand should be the generalizing factor. All right, opening government. There are cases like minority individuals are locked out and separation of power is impossible. 3 responses in general. Firstly, I'm not sure why this is aligned with the motion insofar as democracy is about majority and following what the majority want, because that is how you're able to at least prevent the monopoly of decision-making power by 1 or 2 monarchies and stuff like this. Secondly, if citizens vote not based on actual desire, but rather based on strategy and things like this, which is a shared argument from OG and CG, that is also a form of revealed preference. You don't have to vote based on your actual like material interest. You can still vote based on like, oh, I want to vote for a winning party. That is also a legitimate preference that you should not just say that these are things that are bad. But lastly, our extension on norm creation means that we can call out, and that is the value of democracy. And because this is a project, now people are more aware of the fact that government curtailing freedom of individual is problematic. But secondly, I suggest the other external pressure, which we uniquely identify from closing opposition, which is why I think that this is a powerful mechanism to ensure that corporate captures are corrected under our set of tasks, which is what opening opposition doesn't give you. Very proud to oppose.
Right. Thank you for that amazing defense of democracy.